Seasteading springs from a family legacy that starts with David Friedman. In 1973, he published The Machinery of Freedom, where he proposed a thought experiment. What if houses could move about and choose their own governments? In 1982, his parents, Milton and Rose Friedman, published Free to Choose, which proposed another thought experiment. What if free people could choose to be governed less? And in 2017, David's son, Patri Friedman, published A Machinery of Freedom to Choose, which is seasteading, and things are turning out well for the David Friedman legacy, and let's find out what he thinks about that.
Hello, sisters! I am here with the legendary David Friedman, who most of you, I am sure, already know, especially if you've been following seasteading. And David, how are you?
I am fine. I have been enjoying Belgrade, a city I've never visited before.
Oh, what do you think so far?
People are friendly, kids are cute, food is inexpensive and tasty.
That's good. That's always good.
The park is interesting.
Oh, and so we are here right now at Liberticon. It's one of the events you are attending.
Yes.
You are also attending the celebration of the third anniversary of Liberland.
Yes, and I am also giving talks in Bucharest, Sofia, Prague, Budapest, Maastricht, Oslo, and Oxford.
Whoa, Oslo also.
Yes, if I'm going to come this far, I might as well take advantage of it.
I agree.
Oslo, it is the Norwegian libertarian, I'm not sure if they call it Libertarian Party, but no, Capitalist Party, wrong.
Oh, really?
Yes, the Capitalist
Wow.
Party in Norway, I think is what they call it.
Oh,
And
I
they're
didn't
having
know.
some kind of a one-day conference or something, which I'm speaking at.
How do you feel attending one event like this one where everybody has read your books and follows your thinking?
I doubt that everybody has read my books,
No.
or even one of my books, but some of the people have, and some of the people think the ideas are interesting, and
Yes.
some of them understand it, and that's fun. One of the nice things about writing books is that you can spread your ideas at zero marginal cost. Since once the book is written, it doesn't cost me anything when one more person reads it.
That is true. And you are brought to really nice places like
Yes.
this one to
Uh-huh.
share your ideas.
That's right.
I like it.
I have long said that the World Wide Web is a clumsy institution for selling information, but a wonderful institution for giving it away. And so the trick for dealing on the web is to find some way of giving away information that nonetheless achieves your objectives. And since I have multiple books and many, many articles up to be read for free on my webpage, the result is that people invite me to places like Belgrade and
Yes.
take good care of me and get me a hotel and give me an audience of people who want to listen to me talk. And like many people, I like people listening to me talk.
Yes.
So it works very nicely.
I actually visited your website and I saw that there's a few more David Friedmans. One of them is a porn star, and you.
I'm not sure if he was a star. I think he was a producer. I think he was a producer of pornographic films, actually,
Okay.
not a star.
So that's why your middle
And
name.
there's another one. There is another one who is a famous musician,
Oh.
and various other people. No, it's quite a common name. My website is David D. Friedman,
Uh-huh.
and if I had gotten it 6 months earlier, it would be David Friedman. But another David Friedman grabbed the simple version of the name.
Well, it is so hard nowadays to get the domain that you want. With our cryptocurrency, for example, we were first thinking Ccoin because what we do is seasteading, as you know, and all the domains were taken. There were so many domains taken that we had to choose .global. But now we change it to Varyon because one of the things that we and that seasteading is about, and you know this very well because you are the dad of Patri, is to increase the variety of governance and to use the ocean as a tabula rasa where we can create that. How do you feel knowing that you gave birth or you conceived such a great.
I am very fond of my son. I think seasteading is a neat idea. It may work and it may not work, but if it does work, it will be a very good thing.
Yes.
And that the essential point is not that it's at sea. The essential point is a flexible mechanism for trying different government institutions in such a way that if you have 100 people and after a couple of years they don't get along with each other, 50 of them can call up a tugboat and move away and create a new community with other people. So that's a very clever idea, and we hope it works.
How would be your ideal seastead?
I don't know. I have not thought about that. Seasteading is Patri's project, not mine.
Can you at least tell us, because you've spoken or you've written about privatizing court systems.
Yes.
How do you see that deployed on seasteading?
The reason it's hard to answer that is that a seastead is probably going to be a fairly small population. So that in the seastead, you're getting your competitive governance not by individuals staying where they are and choosing a provider of services, but by individuals being free to move.
Yes.
So my guess is that unless you have a very large seastead, you're probably not going to have the model I described in Machinery of Freedom, that the part of the point of that model was that you could change your, in effect, government, change the firm that was providing you rights protection and dispute settlement without moving. And the point of seasteading is that moving is easy.
Yes.
So therefore, I don't think that that's the obvious mechanism for your system. But
what would be the ideal or the obvious mechanism for
I don't
seastead?
know. I think that a particular community might try some form of government.
Exactly.
And another community will try a different one.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting book by Ronald Coase, who was a very important economist who died a few years ago. And his final project was a book on how China went capitalist.
Oh, interesting.
And he co-authored it with a Chinese economist. And if I correctly understand him, he thinks that things work better in China than they would have worked if they had tried to design the system on the theory of Western economists, even if they had used economists from Chicago instead of Harvard.
Okay.
Because what they actually did was a sort of trial and error process in which the critical correct decision Deng made was that when something that he hadn't planned happened and worked, he didn't suppress it.
Great.
So that by Coase's account, most of the things that fixed China were not things the government planned. That the government made some steps towards making things work better that maybe have helped a little. But one of the big changes was moving to something close to private ownership of land in agriculture.
Okay.
And that was done illegally in several different villages, independently. There was one village where the peasants decided that it would work better if each family was in charge of its piece of land and got the stuff grown there instead of everybody sharing.
Okay.
And they did that covertly for a while. And there was another one where it was the local communist administrator who decided that, and he did it secretly with the peasants' cooperation.
Okay.
And in both places it worked very well.
Okay.
And eventually they went public and they told the government what they were doing, and the government says, well, this is illegal, but we're not going to punish you.
That's good, because it's working.
And then they didn't go that far then. Then they said after a while, in places where the present system is working really badly, you're allowed to do this.
Okay.
And then that worked. And they said everybody should do it.
Oh.
And there were a number of other things which had that kind of pattern, that the special economic zones,
Yes.
at least officially the original theory of the special economic zones was that they were going to run capitalism in quarantine, as it were, so they could learn from it. That you would take areas that weren't very important, so if it didn't work, it wouldn't matter.
Oh.
And you would have those areas you could have capitalism, and then the good socialists could watch it, and they could say, what are the good ideas from capitalism that we can borrow, and the bad ideas we don't do. But what actually happened was the exception ate the rule. The special economic zones, I think Jean Men went up to something like 20 million people, if I remember correctly, something like that, from being tiny.
Wow.
And so eventually they had more and more special economic zones, and that became the whole country in effect.
Oh.
So at least Coase's view, I think, was that designing an economy is really too hard a problem to do on theoretical grounds.
Yes.
And that by doing trial and error, they had blundered into something that worked pretty well. So
Yes.
similarly, I think that a local government might work if you've got a competitive market for local governments.
Yes.
And we'll find out.
What you're saying reminds me a bit, and I'm going to ask you a very not so common question. So, on the other side of the spectrum of anarcho-capitalism, there is anarcho-communism.
Yes.
And what do you, they both share, or they both come together in many instances, one of them being a critique towards centralized state, organizing human communities, organizing resources, organizing the market also.
But the problem with anarcho-communism is that they do not have a solution to the coordination problem. That the problem is in any large society, you need some way of making sure that if I want to make a car, somebody is producing enough steel and enough rubber and enough glass. And if you want to make steel, someone is producing enough ore and enough coal and so forth. Somehow you've got to mesh the plans of many millions of people.
Yes.
And the market provides a decentralized way of doing that.
Yes.
And as far as I know, it's the only decentralized way that works on a large scale. So that you can have anarcho-communism on the scale of 100 or 200 people who are true believers and have a leader they will follow. There was a famous example in America in the 19th century, the Oneida Commune, which worked basically until the founder got old. And one of his sons ended up converting it into a company which still exists and which produces silverware, Oneida Silverware Company.
Oh.
But it was initially a common ownership, a group family, very odd and sort of radical kind of institution, and it seems to have worked fairly smoothly for one generation. But as far as I know, the anarcho-communists really don't have a way, at least I haven't heard of any way, whereas what the anarcho-capitalists say is, well, decentralized prices, market, property works for a whole lot of things on a large scale, let's use it for everything. Yes. So that's the fundamental difference, I think.
So if we speak of a general world political or market order that is very decentralized and that follows what anarcho-capitalism explains and stands for, it is possible to coexist at a local scale with attempts. And the reason why I ask,
most families are communist organizations.
Yes.
Right? In most families, the husband and wife do not pay each other, buy each other's services. Now, it varies. There's one family I happen to know of.
Yes.
Because the husband is an ex-student of mine, an economist. And the kids in that had market interactions with each other. So that
marketing what?
Market interactions with each other. So if one kid owned a game,
yes,
he would rent it to another kid who wanted to use it, one of his brothers. And the parents did not give the kids an allowance, nor did they give the kids chores. They took bids for doing chores. So they said, we have a chore we want to do. Which of our sons is willing to do it for the lowest price?
Whoa.
So that was not how we did it. But that's how John Lott and his wife did it. I had an interesting discussion on my blog at one point about the difference between two different families of economists and how they ran their family. And the fun thing was that in the comment thread on the blog, there was a comment by one of John's sons saying that he thought it might have been better if they'd done it our way. And there was a comment by one of my kids saying that it might have been better to have done it their way.
Wow.
But that was quite interesting.
What was your way?
We basically, it was a communist institution, the way most families are, that, the kids interacted. It was a libertarian communist institution in that we had very few constraints on the kids. The basic rule for dinner was that the kids either had to eat what we made or had to provide themselves with something that was reasonably nutritious and that required no extra work for us.
Like what?
Well, our son was very fond of fruit-flavored yogurt.
fruit flavored yogurt. I like that.
And
Yeah.
so, since that doesn't require any cooking, we could just have
Uh-huh.
that in the refrigerator. If you didn't like what was for dinner, you could have that instead.
Sounds like my type of food. It's just
But
there.
but in general, it was libertarian, but it was not really a market interaction. We didn't pay them to do things or whatever. But John did, and both
How
systems worked.
interesting. Because there's not a blueprint. And that's what we stand for, increasing the possibility of self-organizing however it works for a specific family,
Yeah.
for a specific community, for a specific
Yeah.
system.
But there's no reason why within a libertarian society there shouldn't be communes larger than families.
Yes.
If there are a group of people, as you know, some religious groups do essentially communes, that's fine as long as people are free to
Yes.
leave if they don't like it.
Elinor Ostrom, for example, she defends very small self-organized institutions
Yes.
for collective action, and she says they need to be small.
Yes, I should read. I know of her work at secondhand, but I have not actually read it, and I should because she seems to be an interesting
Yes.
person from what I can
Yeah,
tell.
I am right now, so I'm doing my PhD on the Floating Island project, and my first 3 chapters were about your work, and now I am putting in dialogue, so I'm a complexity scientist, so I'm putting in dialogue different perspectives, and I have found that your work interacts very well with Elinor Ostrom. So when I finish writing the chapter that I'm writing right now, I'll send it to you to see what you think.
Have you read James Scott's work?
No.
Because he's somebody who thinks of himself as a left-winger, but whose views in some ways I think also fit in. He has his 2 good books. One of them is called Seeing Like a State, and it's a description of the ways in which governments had to modify the societies they rule to make them more rulable.
Ouch, yes.
And the things like, think about France, say around the 17th century. And if the government in Paris sends somebody to run things in Provence, he will have to have a translator. Because in Provence they speak Provençal,
really?
not French. They did then.
Okay.
So one of the things that the French state does over time is to try to eliminate the local languages and replace them with a single language.
Oh, wow.
Similarly, if they want to tax land, it's easier to tax land if all of France has the same rules for land ownership and the same rules for measuring land and so forth. So over time, they try to push that. And he's not in favor of that. But he's describing the ways in which it gets done. The other interesting book is a book called, I think, The Art of Not Being Governed.
I like that.
And he's discussing mostly Southeast Asia. He's an anthropologist whose field was that, I think.
Okay.
And he is arguing that the people in the states in Southeast Asia, until fairly recently, there were generally stateless areas surrounding the states, people up in the mountains or in the swamps. And that the people in the states think of those as primitive people who haven't yet gotten up to sort of the modern state. But it isn't true. That if you really look at the history, there's a long period when states are doing well, they expand, they pull in people either by slave raiding or just by attracting immigrants. And then when the state's doing badly, they contract and people move out into the stateless areas. So and he discusses what are the features that make it harder to rule an area.
Oh,
because well, he's very pessimistic in the sense that he thinks that it doesn't work very well anymore, but that, for example, places where transportation is slow and costly, like swamps and mountains, it is harder for a government to monitor people, to tax them. But to take one example of a point that would never occur to me, he is arguing that it is much easier to tax people to control people who grow a crop like rice or wheat.
Why?
Because it's all harvested, it's in a warehouse somewhere, the army can come in and seize it if you aren't good. Whereas if the crop are root vegetables, like potatoes or yams, they're in the ground.
Yes.
The people who planted them know where they are. And there is no easy way of coming in and seizing them. So that's sort of one example where he's arguing that features of what the society is like affect how easy it is to rule it. So it's a very interesting book. But one of the things I found funny in one of the books is that he pretty clearly realizes that libertarians will like what he's writing. But he wants to make it clear he's not one of those icky libertarians. He's a good left-winger. And so he
Okay.
has occasional sort of negative comments that aren't really relevant to what he's writing about.
Okay.
But he's an interesting guy. I like him.
Okay.
I've debated him on one occasion and had interesting conversations with him. But that's a different person who, from my standpoint, really is in the same intellectual world, even though he politically thinks of himself as on the other side. And there are other people of whom that's true. But it's worth both of those books. I think are worth reading.
Okay. Seeing like a state
and The Art of Not Being Governed. I think I've got the title right. It's something, and it's James Scott is his name.
I think both names resonate in my
Yep.
mind.
Yep.
Yes.
But as Eleanor Ostrom, I ought to read and haven't. But the Kosen Ning Wang is his co-author book on how China went capitalist is really quite interesting.
Okay. I will keep it in mind.
So where are you getting your PhD?
My PhD is at the University of Warwick in the UK.
Aha.
But I'm Colombian.
Yes.
But I live there.
Yes.
Yes.
I know nothing about the University of Warwick.
So it is located in a city called Coventry, which was the city that
Which was a famous city.
Exactly, because of the Second World War.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it was fully bombarded. It was fully, it crumbled into pieces.
Mm.
But now it has a very good university. It has, it was I think, top 6 this year of universities with more international students. Although I think that those measures don't account for diversity within those students, but still, it's a really cool university where they allow me to study seasteading and libertarianism and anarchism.
The other book of mine that you ought to look at hasn't been published yet, but it's up on my webpage.
Okay.
I currently have a couple of publishers looking at it, and that's called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours.
From ours, yes, I know, yeah. Uh-huh.
Because that's also one of the questions people always ask me is which is the best legal system, and my answer is, as far as I know, there isn't one. That different societies have different legal systems, and all of them have problems, and they all have some virtues. And what I want to do is to understand them, not to say this is the one that everybody should follow.
Yeah. So you would never run for president?
I would not vote for president or run for president. I would not run for president. No, I would prefer to maintain an honest profession rather than become a criminal.
Even if the government and the society would definitely benefit from having you
I
as
don't
president.
think it would.
No?
I think I would not be a very good president.
Why?
Because that requires a set of skills that I don't have.
Like lying.
Maybe, and like being good at figuring out who will be good subordinates, and being good at persuading the mass of the population of things, and so forth. So
you are so right.
So I don't think I would do a good job of being president.
Okay. What have you noticed? What has been summarized in a few words? The main change in your ideas that you've seen since the beginning of your academic and scholarly life and intellectual life to now?
Well, the beginning of my intellectual life starts pretty early.
With a physics degree.
No, much longer, much earlier than that.
Okay.
Much earlier than that. It starts with when I was, I suppose, 14 or 15 or 16, with the problem that I could see no reason to believe that the fact that the government passed a law made it morally obligatory.
Yes.
But at the same time, it seemed to me that if people didn't believe that, a society wouldn't work because you couldn't compel everybody to obey the law.
Okay.
And that was a problem. And I decided, as a temporary measure, that I would act as if you were obliged to obey the law and obey laws while I tried to think through the question.
Okay.
And after, I don't know, some number of years, it occurred to me that I seemed to be the only person acting that way. That in fact, most people felt free to drive 10 miles over the speed limit.
Okay.
That most people felt free to drink a glass of wine to a friend who was a year or two under the legal age for drinking, and so forth. And so since my society had not collapsed, it must be the case that a society could function without people believing that.
Yes.
And I concluded that what actually is necessary is enough of a balance between laws that people agree with and laws that are enforced well enough so it's people's interest to obey them, and laws that aren't enforced but where people breaking them doesn't do too much damage for a working society. So that would be, I say, the first big change. Then beyond that, the next change, I guess, was that I was initially a classical liberal, that I assumed that things like running the economy should be done through the market, but that you needed a framework of laws and law enforcement provided by government within which the market worked.
Okay.
And it seemed to me that I thought I could prove that, even though I'd never really done it explicitly. It seemed sort of obvious that you needed a framework from outside.
Okay.
And what really persuaded me I was wrong about that was a science fiction novel by Heinlein, Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
Okay.
Because he gave what seemed to me an internally consistent picture of a fictional society in which there was in effect law and there was not government. And if a theorem is true, it's always true. That if you in mathematics, a single counterexample refutes a theorem.
Yeah.
So if I was right in believing that his story was a consistent story, it couldn't be true that you always had to have a framework produced from the outside.
Yes.
That you could have a system where the framework was itself endogenous.
Yes.
And so I started trying to figure out what the equivalent of his system would be for my society. And Machinery of Freedom came out of that project. So that was the point at which I was shifting from the classical liberal to the anarcho-capitalist position. And that was probably when I was in college or maybe in graduate school. I'm not sure. I can't time it accurately enough.
When you're studying physics.
Yeah, well, undergraduate I was studying chemistry and physics. In graduate I was studying physics. And I got a doctorate in physics, and I spent a couple of years as a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia in physics, during which time I was writing Machinery of Freedom,
Wow.
and also was writing a piece on population for the Population Council. And I concluded from that I was a better economist than a physicist. And fortunately, Julie Margolis, who was running a semi-independent center at University of Pennsylvania, called the Fels Center of State and Local Government, I think it was called, but it was really sort of an extra economics department at Penn.
Okay.
And he had seen some of my stuff, and he offered to find me a postdoctoral position at Fels while I switched fields.
Wow.
So I spent 2 years at Fels as a postdoc and 1 year at Penn as a lecturer. And somewhere in that period, I wrote my first economics published journal article, which was an economic theory of the size and shape of nations, in which I offered a explanation of the map of Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present, in terms of governments competing for territory, where I had an explanation of why under some circumstances that gave you an equilibrium with small governments and under some circumstances with large governments, and of what shapes the governments would end up being in that system. And that was eventually published in the Journal of Political Economy. When I originally submitted the article, it was rejected by George Stigler, who was the editor of the Journal of Political Economy and who I had known since I was a small child because he was one of my father's best friends. And he rejected it on the grounds that in his journal, in order to publish an article, you have to have some empirical tests of your theory.
Oh, that happens often.
And my article was only theory. So he had some suggestions that didn't work for testing the theory, but I thought up some ways of testing the theory and resubmitted and got published. And I've been grateful to George ever since, because what I learned from that was not mainly whether my theory was true. The fact that the evidence supported it helped. But that in order to figure out how to test the theory, I had to be much more careful and precise about what the theory said.
Okay.
That it's easy to use vague words, but once you say, well, how could you actually measure this?
Yes.
You then have to get much more precise. And I thought that was a very useful lesson.
That's academia.
So that was my first published journal article. And my argument since is that a PhD in a different field plus an article in a good journal is an adequate substitute for a PhD in economics. Because after all, the PhD in the other field shows that I can work.
Yeah. And
the journal article is a better credential than a doctoral thesis, because most doctoral theses don't get published, especially not in top journals. At some point during those 3 years, I met Jim Buchanan. And Jim was essentially doing the same sort of thing I was, namely applying economics to political institutions.
From Buchanan and Tulloch.
Yes.
Okay.
And he was using economics to understand political institutions, which was what my Size of Nations thing was doing in a different way. And so he invited me to come to VPI as an assistant professor of economics.
Wow.
And so I spent a fair while at VPI with Buchanan and Tulloch and various other people in their public choice center. Gordon Tulloch used to claim that he had published more pages of economics than were assigned in all of the economics courses he had taken. And I told him that I achieved that with my first page. Gordon was a lot of fun. He's unfortunately, neither of them is still alive, but he was a very interesting and original and crazy person who I liked. But anyway, so I spent a fair while there and ended up doing several other things. But in particular, I went from there to UCLA, spent a number of years at UCLA. At VPI, I met the woman I'm now married to, and after many years, I finally persuaded her of the virtue of long-term contracting. And since she was working for Shell as a geologist in New Orleans, I got a position at Tulane in New Orleans and moved to Tulane and spent some years there. And then I got involved in a controversy in journals.
You got involved in a controversy.
Chicago. What?
You got involved in a controversy.
The controversy was between two very good University of Chicago economists and two very good University of Chicago law school professors.
Okay.
And it was there was an article by George Stigler, the same Stigler, and Gary Becker on the compensation of enforcers, in which they were discussing why the way in which we enforce criminal law is not incentive compatible.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know the article, but
but I do know all the flaws that penal system has.
Well, it's not all the flaws. They have their particular point, the way I give their argument, not the way they did it. I'm a cop and you're a criminal, and I've got the goods on you. I've got the evidence that will get you sent to jail.
Uh-huh.
The cost to you of being sent to jail is $100,000.
Okay.
The benefit to me of sending you to jail is a gold star on my report card.
Yes.
I look a little better. And that will raise my lifetime income by $10,000.
Okay.
And from the standpoint of a television program, the answer is obvious. I turn the evidence over to the DA and you get arrested. From the standpoint of economics, the result is also obvious. Markets exist to move assets to their highest valued use. The evidence that will convict you is worth $100,000 to you and $10,000 to me. So you pay me $50,000 and I burn the evidence.
Uh-huh.
And the point that Stigler and Becker was making was that therefore, in order for the system to work, you need a second layer of cops watching the first layer, because it's not in the private interest of the first layer to do what you want them to do. And they suggested that you could fix that system by shifting to a system where instead of paying policemen a salary, when you got convicted, I got $100,000. So that you would have, and Landis and Posner, who were the law school people, discussed a number of issues that Becker and Stigler hadn't really thought about, and pointed out that what Becker and Stigler were really doing was reinventing tort law. Okay. Because in tort law, when you commit a tort, I, the victim, sue you, and your punishment is the damages you pay to me.
Uh-huh.
And I got interested in that. And I ended up writing two different articles, one of which was on the legal institutions of Saga period Iceland, because that was a system where when you killed somebody, his relatives sued you. So it was, in effect, a system where, in some sense, tort law swallowed criminal law. And the other was on a technical point where Landis and Posner had argued there was a particular respect in which what came out of the Becker-Stigler proposal could not work as well as a perfect government-run system. They weren't claiming the government system was perfect, but they was claiming there was an inherent weakness. And I showed that they were wrong, that there was a way of changing the assumed institutions that solved their particular insoluble problems. So I published two articles, and Landis and Posner invited me to come to the University of Chicago to argue with them at a closer distance.
Wow.
And I ended up spending about 10 years as a visiting faculty fellow at University of Chicago Law School. And eventually I concluded that they were not going to persuade their colleagues that they needed another economist as a permanent position. So I took a position at a law school in California, which is where I spent the next 22 years, and I've just retired from that. So that's my sequence of events. But I would say that my views haven't changed very much since the point when I wrote Machinery of Freedom. I think if you look at the third edition, which has got another 100 pages, there are some cases where I thought through more thoroughly the ideas I had there.
Okay.
And there's some additional stuff. But I don't think there's really anything where I concluded I was wrong there. And so, I should say some of the additional stuff was really credited to Jim Buchanan, because Jim Buchanan wrote the only good review of Machinery of Freedom, where what I mean by a good review is not a friendly review, but a review that makes the author think. And he pointed out a weakness in the argument that I had there for how my system would work.
Okay.
And so I spend a chapter in the third edition, in a sense, responding to that criticism. Because he was right. That is, I hadn't thought through certain implications of the system. And so I tried to think those through. So that's to Jim's credit.
Which was the critique?
The criticism was that in my system, if you have two rights enforcement agencies which disagree about what legal rule they want, there is bargaining between them, and whichever one values the rule more will end up getting it in exchange for some kind of a side payment. But I had not thought about the question of what the starting point was. So if my agency wants a death penalty and yours doesn't, does that mean that I have to pay you to get you to agree to a death penalty? Or does it mean that you have to pay me to get me to agree not to a death penalty?
Okay.
That I didn't have a starting point, where I didn't have a default system. And then the argument arises that what's going to really give you the default is the ability of each of us to threaten to use force against the other. And that then might destabilize the system, because although for enforcing rights there's no real economy of scale very far up, there might be an economy of scale in winning fights. And I then discuss, if you read that chapter in the third edition, I discuss what the implications of that are and why under some circumstances the system might be unstable, especially when you were just setting it up.
Okay.
So that was a way in which I benefited from Jim's criticism.
Well, in academia you benefit more from when and you know this by having done a PhD, you are really beaten up intellectually in a PhD. So
sometimes. But anyway, so that was, but that was not a major change. That was a matter of my thinking through a part of the argument which I had not thought through, and it slightly modifies my conclusions, but not by very much.
Okay, wow.
But that's all in the third edition.
Okay, I don't think. And what were you studying when you were studying physics?
I was a theoretical physicist, and I was doing a particular bit of theoretical physics which I don't think has survived, called Reggie-Pole theory. And I think explaining that would get a little complicated, but it had to do with a mathematical approach to understanding elementary particles.
Okay.
And one which is, I haven't really followed it since. I mean, I really dropped out of physics and spent my time in economics, but I think it did not end up working. But that was what I was working in at the time.
So you would never consider going to econophysics, which is
going back into physics?
Econophysics.
What is econophysics?
Econophysics is using, for example, studying human societies as if they were particles.
I don't think
so. You use statistical mechanics.
That does not sound to me very useful.
No, but it is.
Oh, statistical mechanics might be. But statistical mechanics is not what I was doing. Statistical mechanics is a part of physics that was worked out a long time ago. Yeah. No, I like to say that the only benefit I get from having a doctorate in theoretical physics is that I can do non-mathematical economics, and people won't accuse me of being afraid of mathematics.
Good point. You're right.
Okay, so your interview should start very soon.
Okay. Well, David, thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope this is useful for your
absolutely. We are and all Blue Frontiers are really happy.
Good.
That you are here with me in Liberland in the events that celebrate the 3rd anniversary of Liberland in Belgrade and in Budapest. Also, I hope to see you in Budapest. And what else? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on the Blue Frontiers podcast. To learn more about our work and find out how you can support the project, visit blue-frontiers.com. or visit our social channels. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Blue Frontiers, or shoot us a note via our website. If you learned something and enjoyed the show, tell a friend or leave us a positive review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. Don't forget to subscribe to our show and remember to join us for the next episode. See you next time.